July 6th, 2019, Teterboro Airport, New Jersey. A private jet with tail number N550GP touches down just after 4 p.m. Federal agents from the FBI and Homeland Security investigations are already positioned near the tarmac. As the stairs descend, Jeffrey Epstein, tanned, casually dressed, carrying nothing but a small bag, steps onto American soil for what will be the last time as a free man. Within minutes, he is surrounded, handcuffed, and placed under arrest on federal sex trafficking charges. The indictment, unsealed hours later in Manhattan, accuses him of operating a sprawling network that recruited and abused dozens of underage girls between 2002 and 2005. Less than 5 weeks later, on the morning of August 10, 2019, correctional officers at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Lower Manhattan discover Epstein unresponsive in his cell. He is pronounced dead at New York Downtown Hospital. The official determination by the New York City Chief Medical Examiner is suicide by hanging. Questions about broken cameras, sleeping guards, removed cellmate, and the removal from suicide watch swirl immediately and never fully subside. A man who once moved among presidents, royalty, billionaires, and Nobel laureates is gone, leaving behind an estate worth over $600 million, 2 islands, a Manhattan townhouse the size of a small embassy, and a trail of victims, co-conspirators, and unanswered questions that still reverberate in courtrooms and newsrooms years later. To understand how Jeffrey Epstein reached that jet in 2019 and how the system allowed him to operate for so long, one must go back more than 6 decades to a very different starting point. Jeffrey Edward Epstein was born on January 20th, 1953, in Brooklyn, New York, to Pauline Stolofsky and Seymour Epstein. The family lived in the working-class Seagate neighborhood near Coney Island. His father worked for the New York City Parks Department as a groundskeeper and later as a maintenance man for the Department of Housing Preservation and Development. His mother was a school aide and homemaker. The Epsteins were modest, Jewish, middle class. Neither parent had attended college. Jeffrey showed early academic promise. He skipped 2 grades and graduated from Lafayette High School in 1969 at age 16. That same year, he enrolled at Cooper Union to study physics, transferring 2 years later to New York University's Current Institute of Mathematical Sciences. Despite strong performance in mathematics and physics courses, he never completed a degree. By 1974, he had dropped out. In the fall of 1974, at age 21 and without a bachelor's degree, Epstein secured a teaching position at the Dalton School, one of Manhattan's most exclusive private institutions. The school served the children of Wall Street executives, media moguls, and cultural figures. How an unfinished college student landed the job remains a point of speculation. Some accounts credit a connection through a girlfriend whose father had ties to the school's administration. Others point to Epstein's demonstrated charisma and self-confidence during interviews. He taught math and physics to high school students and, by several former colleagues' later recollections, cultivated a reputation as an unconventional, magnetic teacher who paid special attention to certain female students and parents alike. Dalton was more than a job. It was Epstein's entry ticket into elite circles. Among the parents of his students was Alan Greenberg, then chairman of Bear Stearns, one of Wall Street's most aggressive investment banks. According to multiple published accounts, including testimony from former Bear Stearns executives, Epstein began tutoring Greenberg's son in math.
Impressed by Epstein's intellect and drive, Greenberg offered him a position at the firm in 1976 as a junior assistant in the options trading department. Epstein had no formal finance training, no Series 7 license at the time he started, and no conventional resume. Yet within 3 years, he rose to become a limited partner at Bear Stearns, an extraordinary trajectory for someone in his mid-20s with no degree. Colleagues later described him as brilliant with numbers, unusually persuasive, and willing to bend rules when it suited him. By 1981, however, questions about his trading practices surfaced internally. Bear Stearns asked him to leave. The departure was officially framed as a mutual decision. At roughly the same time, Epstein began telling people he was an intelligence asset or worked in covert financial matters, claims he repeated in different forms over the decades but never substantiated with evidence. Whether these statements were bravado, deliberate misdirection, or something else is unclear. What is certain is that by the early 1980s, he had already mastered a core skill, projecting power and mystery to those who valued both. Psychologically, the pattern was already visible. Epstein displayed classic traits associated with narcissistic personality structure: an inflated sense of self-importance, a constant need for admiration, a willingness to exploit relationships for personal gain, and a striking absence of empathy when pursuing his desires. He was not physically imposing, 5 feet 11 inches, slight build, but he compensated with relentless confidence, name-dropping, and an uncanny ability to read what powerful people wanted to hear. That combination would prove far more dangerous than any weapon. By 1981, Epstein was no longer a teacher or a junior trader. He was positioning himself as a money manager for the ultra-wealthy. The next step would catapult him into a world few outsiders ever enter.
Part 2. The Ascent to Power. By the early 1980s, Jeffrey Epstein had left Bear Stearns behind and reinvented himself as an independent financial consultant. He founded Intercontinental Assets Group, Inc., IAG, in 1981, a small firm ostensibly focused on asset recovery and international money management for high-net-worth individuals. Public records from that period are sparse. Epstein rarely filed detailed disclosures, and the firm operated with minimal regulatory footprint. He presented himself as a specialist in financial intelligence and offshore structures, services that appealed to clients who valued discretion above all. The real turning point came in the mid-1980s when Epstein met Leslie Wexner, the billionaire founder and chairman of L Brands, parent company of Victoria's Secret, Bath & Body Works, and Abercrombie & Fitch. Wexner, based in Columbus, Ohio, was already one of America's wealthiest retail magnates. How the two men connected remains a subject of conflicting accounts. Some reports suggest the introduction came through mutual acquaintances in New York's Jewish philanthropic circles. Others point to Epstein's growing reputation as a fixer who could handle complex private financial matters. Whatever the origin, the relationship quickly deepened. By the late 1980s, Epstein was acting as Wexner's personal financial advisor, managing significant portions of his wealth. In 1991, Wexner granted Epstein sweeping power of attorney over his finances, a rare level of trust that gave Epstein control over bank accounts, real estate transactions, investments, and even charitable disbursements. This arrangement lasted for more than a decade. The most visible symbol of that trust was property. In 1989, Wexner purchased a massive 21,000-square-foot limestone townhouse at 9 East 71st Street in Manhattan's Upper East Side for $13.2 million. The mansion, originally built for a member of the Vanderbilt family, featured 9 stories, a ballroom, an elevator, and a 7-story atrium. In 1996, Wexner transferred the deed to Epstein for the nominal sum of $0, a quitclaim transfer. Epstein would later claim the property was compensation for financial services rendered, though the exact value of those services was never publicly documented. The townhouse became Epstein's primary residence and, according to later court filings, one of the central locations for his criminal activities. Epstein's wealth grew rapidly during this period. He acquired a Palm Beach mansion at 358 El Brillo Way in 1990
for $2.5 million. The 18,000 square foot estate sat on prime oceanfront land and included a guest house, pool, tennis court, and extensive security measures. In the late 1990s, he purchased Little St. James, a 70-acre private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands, for $7.95 million. He renamed it Little St. Jeff in private circles and began extensive renovations, including a main residence, guest villas, a helipad, and what prosecutors would later describe as infrastructure designed to facilitate isolation and control. By the mid-1990s, Epstein had also established J. Epstein and Company, later Financial Trust Company, a money management firm that claimed to accept only clients with net worth exceeding $1 billion. Epstein frequently told people he managed assets exclusively for billionaires, though the only publicly confirmed long-term client was Wexner. Other high-profile names, Leon Black, Glenn Dubin, Mort Zuckerman, were linked to him through business or social ties, but the full scope of his client list has never been fully disclosed due to the private nature of the arrangements. Financial success brought Epstein into ever closer proximity to global power. He cultivated relationships with former U.S. presidents, British royalty, prominent scientists, hedge fund managers, and media figures.
He hosted dinners at the East 71st Street mansion featuring Nobel laureates and politicians. He donated generously to institutions. Harvard University received more than $9 million from Epstein-linked entities between 1998 and 2008, and positioned himself as a patron of intellectual pursuits. These associations served multiple purposes. They burnished his image as an elite insider, provided access to influential networks, and, according to later victim statements, helped create an aura of untouchability. Psychologically, this phase reveals the deepening of Epstein's manipulative traits. He exhibited what criminologists describe as instrumental charm, the calculated use of flattery, gifts, promises of opportunity, and displays of power to lower defenses and secure compliance. He was adept at identifying vulnerabilities, financial need in young women he would later approach, professional ambition in academics he courted, or social insecurity in powerful men seeking validation. His wealth acted as both carrot and shield. It enabled extravagant hospitality while simultaneously insulating him from ordinary accountability. Yet subtle warning signs began to emerge even in these years of ascent. In the early 1990s, a former modeling agency employee alleged that Epstein had made inappropriate advances toward underage girls during supposed scouting sessions in New York. The complaint did not lead to charges at the time. In 1993, a woman who worked at his Palm Beach home later told investigators she had witnessed young women coming and going in ways that raised questions, though no formal report was filed then. These early whispers were easily dismissed or buried beneath Epstein's growing stature and the reluctance of institutions to scrutinize a major donor or connected figure. By the late 1990s, Epstein had constructed a near-perfect facade. Immense wealth, famous friends, private islands, and an aura of intellectual and financial mystique. The machinery that would later be labeled a sex trafficking enterprise was already taking shape behind closed doors, quietly at first, then with increasing boldness. Part 3. The network takes root. By the mid-1990s, Jeffrey Epstein had transformed from a self-made financier into the architect of an expansive, multi-continental lifestyle designed for both prestige and privacy. Central to this expansion was the acquisition of Little St. James, the 70-acre Caribbean island he purchased in April 1998
through a Virgin Islands shell company for $7.95 million. He immediately began developing it into a private retreat, a sprawling main residence with stone pathways, a temple-like structure on a hilltop, originally intended as a music pavilion, later the subject of much speculation, guest villas, a helipad, docks, and extensive landscaping. The island's isolation, accessible only by boat or helicopter, offered complete control over who entered and left. Epstein also maintained other properties that served as nodes in what prosecutors would later describe as his operational network. The Palm Beach mansion, already owned since 1990, the Manhattan townhouse at 9 East 71st Street, a ranch in New Mexico called Zorro Ranch, purchased in 1993 for approximately $12 million and expanded over the years, and an apartment in Paris. Each location featured similar security features, cameras, gated entrances, private staff, and was used for hosting influential guests, as well as for the activities that would eventually lead to criminal charges. A pivotal figure in this period was Ghislaine Maxwell. Born in 1961 in France to British media mogul Robert Maxwell and his wife Elizabeth, Ghislaine had moved to New York after her father's mysterious death in 1991. He fell from his yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, off the Canary Islands. His empire collapsed amid revelations of massive fraud.
By the early 1990s, she was living in Manhattan, socializing in elite circles, and had become romantically involved with Epstein. Though the precise nature of their relationship evolved over time, described variously as romantic, professional, and later as co-conspiratorial, Maxwell assumed a key operational role. According to court documents and victim statements compiled years later, Maxwell acted as Epstein's principal recruiter, social liaison, and manager of day-to-day logistics. She introduced young women to Epstein under the guise of legitimate opportunities, modeling contracts, educational assistance, massage work, or entry into high society. Many of these women were in their late teens or early 20s, often from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, and were promised career help, money for education, or connections that could change their lives. Maxwell herself came from extraordinary privilege. Her ability to project warmth, sophistication, and authority made her an effective bridge between Epstein's world and vulnerable young women. The recruitment pattern followed a recognizable progression, later analyzed by psychologists and trafficking experts as classic grooming behavior within a network. Initial contact, often through existing employees, acquaintances, or other young women already in Epstein's orbit, a pyramid or tiered structure where compensated recruiters brought in new individuals. Incentives, cash payments for referrals, typically $200 to $300 per successful introduction, promises of modeling opportunities, or direct financial support. Normalization, gradual escalation from social introductions to requests for massages or private time with Epstein, framed as routine or professional. Dependency, financial gifts, travel, or housing created obligations that made it difficult for participants to leave or speak out.
Epstein's psychological profile during this era aligns with what forensic psychologists term preferential or preferential situational offending, combined with narcissistic and Machiavellian traits. He did not appear to target strangers randomly. Instead, he built systems that delivered access to a specific type of victim, young, attractive, often economically or socially vulnerable females, while minimizing personal risk. Wealth and status served as both lure and barrier. The promise of upward mobility drew people in, while fear of losing access or facing powerful retaliation kept them silent. The network extended beyond Maxwell. Several employees, house managers, assistants, pilots, and schedulers, were later identified in court filings as having facilitated travel, scheduled appointments, or handled payments. Epstein maintained detailed records of flights on his private jets. One Boeing 727 became notorious as the Lolita Express in media reports, though the nickname originated later. Flight logs released in subsequent lawsuits show frequent travel with prominent names, former presidents Bill Clinton and Donald Trump on separate occasions, Prince Andrew, prominent lawyers, academics, and entertainers, though association alone does not imply knowledge of or participation in criminal conduct. By the early 2000s, the operation had reached industrial scale in Palm Beach and New York. Young women were brought to the El Brio Way mansion for what were described as massages that frequently involved sexual contact with Epstein. Payments were made in cash or through structured means. Some victims received ongoing financial support in exchange for continued availability. The same pattern appeared at the Manhattan townhouse and, increasingly, on Little St. James, where guests could arrive and depart without public scrutiny. Law enforcement attention remained minimal during this peak period.
Epstein maintained a dedicated scheduler, Ghislaine Maxwell, for much of the period, later assisted by others, who coordinated appointments, travel, and payments. Flight manifests and phone records later obtained by investigators showed frequent shuttling of young women between Florida, New York, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and occasionally Paris or New Mexico. The private jets were used not only for elite guests, but also to transport victims to and from locations where Epstein spent time. Financial mechanisms supported the system. Victims received cash payments after encounters, often in envelopes handed directly by Epstein or staff. Some were given larger sums for longer-term availability, hundreds or thousands of dollars at a time, or promises of modeling contracts, tuition assistance, or career introductions. These payments created both incentive and coercion. Many young women came from unstable or low-income backgrounds and felt trapped by financial dependency. Others feared reputational harm or believed powerful people would protect Epstein if they spoke out. The physical layout of the properties facilitated control and privacy. In Palm Beach, the mansion included a massage room on the second floor with locked doors and drawn blinds. Security cameras, installed ostensibly for protection, monitored entrances and common areas. Staff were instructed to maintain discretion. Some later testified they were told not to ask questions about the young female visitors. Similar setups existed in New York, where the townhouse had multiple bedrooms used for private meetings, and on Little St. James, where remote villas allowed complete seclusion. Investigators later estimated that between 2001 and 2005 alone, more than 30 underage victims were directly exploited in Palm Beach, with additional cases identified in New York and on the island. The total number of individuals harmed over the full 2-decade span remains uncertain, but is believed to exceed 100 based on civil settlements, victim compensation funds, and statements gathered by the FBI and U.S. Virgin Islands authorities. From a psychological perspective, Epstein employed well-documented grooming and control tactics common in organized sexual exploitation. Desensitization. Encounters were framed as normal within his world, with payments normalizing the transactions. Compartmentalization. Victims were often kept unaware of one another initially, reducing the chance of collective resistance. Power imbalance. Epstein leveraged age, wealth, status, and connections to create perceived inevitability and helplessness. Intermittent reinforcement. Alternating kindness, gifts, promises, with demands maintained compliance through hope of future benefit. These methods align with research on preferential offenders who build systems rather than act impulsively. Epstein's narcissism amplified the behavior.
He viewed himself as entitled to access and control, rationalizing exploitation as consensual or mutually beneficial. His ability to compartmentalize, charming intellectuals by day while exploiting vulnerable girls by appointment, reflected a profound lack of moral integration. During this peak period, roughly 2000 to 2005, Epstein continued to cultivate his public image aggressively. He hosted scientists and academics at dinners and conferences, funded research initiatives, and maintained friendships with figures across politics, business, and entertainment. These associations served as both social capital and deterrence. The higher the profile of his circle, the riskier it seemed for anyone to challenge him. Law enforcement remained largely absent from the picture.
Palm Beach police received occasional tips, an anonymous call in 2002 about young girls at the mansion, a parent's concern in 2004, but these were either not pursued aggressively or quickly stalled. Epstein's legal team, including prominent Florida attorneys, was quick to intervene whenever scrutiny appeared. Prosecutors and detectives later acknowledged systemic reluctance. The combination of Epstein's wealth, high-powered counsel, and the sensitive nature of the allegations created hesitation at multiple levels. The machinery ran smoothly for years, insulated by money, connections, and the silence it purchased or coerced. But in March 2005, a single phone call to Palm Beach police would begin to unravel the carefully constructed facade. Part 5. Peak Influence and Early Cracks. From approximately 2002 to 2005, Jeffrey Epstein operated at the height of both his criminal enterprise and his public persona. The Palm Beach mansion at 358 El Brio Way served as the primary hub, with young women arriving almost daily for scheduled appointments. Flight logs from his private aircraft, particularly the Boeing 727, later dubbed the Lolita Express in media coverage, document frequent trips carrying groups that included prominent names alongside the young women being transported. Destinations included New York, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Paris, and occasionally his New Mexico ranch. The island, Little St. James, had by then become fully operational as a retreat. Renovations completed in the early 2000s added guest accommodations, a main house with panoramic views, staff quarters, and infrastructure that allowed Epstein to host extended stays for select visitors. The remote location meant arrivals and departures were controlled entirely by Epstein's staff and pilots. Victims later described being flown there for weekends or longer periods, often under the pretext of vacation, work, or special opportunities. The isolation amplified control. No public transport, no easy way off without cooperation. Epstein continued to leverage his wealth for access and influence. He maintained close ties to former President Bill Clinton, who flew on Epstein's plane multiple times between 2002 and 2003, including trips to Africa for Clinton Foundation-related work. Prince Andrew, Duke of York, visited the Palm Beach estate and Little St. James on several occasions. Other frequent associates included hedge fund managers, scientists, Epstein-funded research at Harvard, MIT, and elsewhere, and entertainment figures. These relationships were cultivated through lavish hospitality, private dinners, island getaways, introductions to elite circles that reinforced Epstein's status as a valuable connector. Financially, Epstein appeared untouchable. His net worth was estimated in the hundreds of millions, derived largely from his long-standing arrangement with Les Wexner, though the exact sources of income remained opaque. He continued to manage assets quietly through offshore entities and the financial trust company, registered in the Virgin Islands. Publicly, he positioned himself as a philanthropist and intellectual patron, donating millions to universities and hosting symposia on science and mathematics. This facade of benevolence
helped deflect scrutiny. Institutions and individuals hesitated to question a generous donor with such powerful friends. Yet beneath the surface, small fissures began to appear. In 2002, an anonymous tip reached Palm Beach police about young girls frequenting the El Brillo Way mansion. The report was logged, but did not trigger an immediate investigation, partly due to lack of specific complainant details, and partly because of the social stature of the resident. Around the same period, a modeling agency in New York raised internal concerns about Epstein's interactions with young, aspiring models. But no formal complaint was filed.
A few parents in Palm Beach expressed unease to friends or school officials about daughters who had visited the house and returned with large sums of cash. But these conversations rarely escalated to official reports. Epstein's own behavior occasionally drew private warnings. Some associates later recounted moments of discomfort, overheard comments, inappropriate requests, or an unsettling focus on young women, but most dismissed or rationalized what they saw. The power dynamics were stark. Questioning Epstein risked alienating a source of introductions, travel, or financial opportunity. From a law enforcement perspective, this period highlights classic investigative blind spots that persisted until 2005. Status bias. Wealthy, connected individuals often receive deferential treatment. Police and prosecutors are more cautious when targets have high-profile attorneys and political ties. Victim reluctance. Many young women feared disbelief, retaliation, or loss of financial support. Others had been conditioned to view the encounters as transactional rather than criminal. Fragmented reporting. Tips came in isolation, without corroboration or follow-up, and crossed jurisdictional lines, Florida, New York, Virgin Islands, that hindered coordination. Lack of proactive monitoring. No routine surveillance existed for private estates or jet travel involving minors. Such measures were reserved for terrorism or narcotics cases at the time. Psychologically, Epstein showed increasing entrenchment in his pattern. Narcissistic offenders often escalate when unchallenged for long periods. The absence of consequences reinforced his sense of invulnerability. He began to treat the exploitation as an entitlement, scheduling it alongside legitimate business and social engagements with little apparent anxiety about detection. This overconfidence would later prove a critical vulnerability. By early 2005, the system had run largely undisturbed for years. The grand jury process itself limited victim participation. Only those subpoenaed testified, and cross-examination by Epstein's defense team was permitted. Epstein's legal representation during this phase was formidable. High-profile attorneys, including Alan Dershowitz, Kenneth Starr, former independent counsel, Gerald Lefcourt, and Florida counsel Jack Goldberger and Roy Black. As the state case progressed slowly, federal authorities entered the picture. In July 2006, the FBI opened a parallel investigation under the codename Operation Leap Year. Special Agent Joe Slattery led the effort out of the Miami field office. Agents re-interviewed victims, subpoenaed flight logs, bank records, and employee statements, and began tracing interstate and international aspects of the activity. By early 2007, the FBI had identified dozens of victims across multiple jurisdictions, confirming the operation's scale went well beyond Palm Beach. This dual-track approach, local prosecution moving toward a plea while federal agents built a broader trafficking case, exposed early coordination problems. Jurisdictional friction. Palm Beach police felt sidelined as the U.S. Attorney's Office in Miami began negotiating directly with Epstein's team.
Victim notification gaps. Federal prosecutors did not consistently inform victims of developments, violating emerging standards under the Crime Victims' Rights Act, passed in 2004 but unevenly applied at the time. Influence of defense counsel. Epstein's lawyers aggressively lobbied both state and federal officials, emphasizing his willingness to cooperate, his philanthropy, and the potential reputational damage of a full trial. Psychologically, this period marked a shift for Epstein. Confronted with real scrutiny for the first time, he did not flee or go silent. Instead, he doubled down on control. He continued travel and social engagements while his attorneys worked behind the scenes.
The behavior reflects a common trait in high-status offenders.
Denial of personal risk, combined with belief that money and connections can resolve any problem. By mid-2007, the state case had stalled in plea negotiations, and the federal probe, now under U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta, intensified. Acosta's office began exploring a non-prosecution agreement that would resolve both state and federal exposure in a single deal. The proposal, controversial from the start, would soon reveal some of the most significant systemic failures in the handling of the case. Part 7. The Controversial Plea Deal. By late 2007, the federal investigation into Jeffrey Epstein had expanded significantly. The FBI's Operation Leap Year had compiled statements from more than 30 victims, flight logs showing interstate and international travel with minors, bank records documenting cash payments, and employee testimony confirming the systematic nature of the recruitment and exploitation. U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta, appointed to the Southern District of Florida in 2005, oversaw the case. His office faced a choice: pursue a full federal indictment on multiple counts, including sex trafficking of minors, which carried severe mandatory minimum sentences, or negotiate a resolution that would avoid a lengthy, high-profile trial. Epstein's defense team, now expanded to include former U.S. Solicitor General Kenneth Starr, Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz, Florida heavyweights Jack Goldberger, Roy Black, and others, mounted an aggressive campaign. They met repeatedly with Acosta's prosecutors, submitted voluminous legal briefs, arguing that the conduct did not meet the threshold for federal trafficking charges, emphasized Epstein's willingness to register as a sex offender, and highlighted potential damage to victims if the case went public.
The defense also pointed to the ongoing state case in Palm Beach, where State Attorney Barry Krischer had already secured a grand jury indictment on relatively minor charges. Negotiations intensified in 2007 and culminated in a non-prosecution agreement, NPA, signed on September 24, 2007, though not finalized until June 30, 2008. The deal's key terms were: Epstein would plead guilty in Florida state court to 2 felony charges: solicitation of prostitution, a third-degree felony, and procurement of a minor for prostitution, also a third-degree felony. He would serve 18 months in county jail, with work release permitted 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, allowing him to leave for work most of each day. He would register as a Level 3 sex offender in Florida. In exchange, the federal government agreed not to bring any further charges against Epstein for conduct occurring between 2001 and 2007. Critically, the agreement granted immunity from federal prosecution to any potential co-conspirators, including unnamed individuals who had facilitated or participated in the activities. The deal was extraordinary in scope. It effectively closed the door on a broader federal case that could have implicated a network of recruiters, schedulers, and possibly others. Prosecutors justified the resolution by citing concerns over victim testimony reliability in court. The difficulty of proving knowledge
and intent in interstate cases, and the risk that a trial might result in acquittal on major counts. Acosta later stated that he believed the agreement ensured Epstein would face prison time and lifelong registration, outcomes not guaranteed in a full trial.
The plea process revealed serious procedural and ethical failures, many of which came to light years later through court challenges and journalistic investigations. Violation of the Crime Victims' Rights Act, CVRA. Enacted in 2004, the CVRA guarantees victims the right to be reasonably protected, notified, and heard in federal proceedings. Between 2007 and 2008, federal prosecutors failed to inform dozens of identified victims about the negotiations or the impending agreement. Victims were not consulted and learned of the deal only after it was signed. In 2019, U.S. District Judge Kenneth A. Mara ruled that the government had violated the CVRA, though the ruling came too late to undo the NPA. Premature closure of the federal probe. FBI agents continued gathering evidence into 2008, but the agreement halted further pursuit. Some investigators believed additional victims and co-conspirators could have been identified with more time. Unusual leniency. The work release provision allowed Epstein to spend most days outside jail at his West Palm Beach office, effectively serving little punitive time. The immunity clause for co-conspirators was broader than typical in such cases, and shielded individuals who might have faced charges. Influence and access. Epstein's legal team leveraged personal and professional connections. Meetings occurred at Acosta's office and elsewhere, and the defense presented arguments that framed Epstein as cooperative rather than predatory. From an institutional perspective, the 2008 deal exemplifies how prosecutorial discretion can falter when facing wealthy, well-represented defendants. In the pre-#MeToo era, sex trafficking cases involving powerful figures often ended in plea deals rather than trials, partly due to evidentiary challenges and institutional caution. The Epstein NPA became a textbook example of what critics call a sweetheart deal, one that prioritized resolution over full accountability. Epstein formally entered his guilty plea in state court on June 30, 2008. He was sentenced to 18 months and began serving time at the Palm Beach County Jail on July 1st. Even during incarceration, he benefited from special treatment, private meetings with lawyers and staff, frequent work release, and eventual transfer to a more comfortable wing. He was released after 13 months, with time credited for good behavior, in July 2009, and required to register as a sex offender. The deal bought Epstein years of relative freedom, but it also planted seeds of future scrutiny. Victims who had been excluded from the process began organizing. Civil attorneys filed suits, and journalists started digging deeper. The system's handling of the case would eventually become as much a part of the story as Epstein himself. Part 8. Years of Relative Freedom. Jeffrey Epstein was released from the Palm Beach County Stockade on July 22, 2009, after serving approximately 13 months of his 18-month sentence. Time credited for good behavior and work release privileges shortened the actual incarceration period. Upon release, he was required to register as a Level 3 sex offender in Florida, the highest risk classification, mandating public notification, quarterly address verification, and restrictions on living near schools or parks. He immediately returned to his Palm Beach mansion at 358 El Brillo Way, though he spent most of his time in New York at the East 71st Street townhouse or traveling to Little St. James and other properties. The sex offender registration imposed conditions, but enforcement proved lax. Florida law required Epstein to report travel plans exceeding 3 days and to check in with authorities upon returning to the state. Records show he frequently traveled, often by private jet, to Paris, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and other locations, without consistent documentation of compliance. Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office deputies conducted periodic residence checks, but no violations were formally pursued during this period. The monitoring system relied heavily on self-reporting, a common weakness in sex offender supervision for high-profile individuals with resources to navigate requirements. Epstein resumed many pre-arrest activities with minimal public disruption. He continued to host dinners at the Manhattan townhouse, attended scientific conferences, and maintained contact with a network of academics, philanthropists, and business figures. Donations flowed through foundations he controlled. Between 2009 and 2018, Epstein-linked entities gave millions to institutions including Harvard, which later returned some funds, MIT, and various medical research programs. These contributions helped sustain his image as an eccentric but generous patron of science. Socially, the circle narrowed somewhat. Some former associates distanced themselves after the 2008 plea became public knowledge. Bill Clinton and Prince Andrew reduced visible contact, though flight logs and other records indicate occasional interactions persisted into the early 2000s. Les Wexner severed formal ties around 2007 to 2008, though the full reasons and timing remain disputed. Epstein retained access to elite networks through intermediaries and continued to cultivate new relationships, particularly in scientific and intellectual communities. Civil litigation provided the primary pressure during these years. Multiple victims filed lawsuits against Epstein, seeking damages for sexual abuse and battery. In 2009, attorney Bradley Edwards filed a federal suit on behalf of 2 victims, alleging Epstein and co-conspirators had violated their rights. Other cases followed, including a 2015 defamation suit by Virginia Giuffre against Ghislaine Maxwell that drew significant attention. Most civil claims settled confidentially with substantial payments from Epstein's estate or trusts. These settlements, estimated in the tens of millions across dozens of cases, silenced many voices through non-disclosure agreements, though some victims later spoke publicly. Law enforcement agencies missed several opportunities to re-engage. Inadequate monitoring. Probation officers and local police did not aggressively verify travel compliance or investigate reports of continued contact with young women. The work release precedent from 2008 to 2009 set a tone of leniency. Fragmented oversight. Jurisdiction was split across Florida, registration, New York, residence, and the Virgin Islands, property ownership. No single agency maintained comprehensive surveillance. Reluctance to reopen. The 2007 non-prosecution agreement barred new federal charges for pre-2008 conduct. Prosecutors viewed the plea as final unless fresh evidence emerged post-agreement. Victim barriers. Many survivors remained traumatized, financially compensated via settlements, or deterred by NDAs and fear of retaliation. Psychologically, this period reflects Epstein's adaptation to partial accountability. Rather than retreat or reform, he compartmentalized. The legal consequences were treated as a resolved business expense, not a moral reckoning. Narcissistic offenders often respond to limited punishment by rationalizing it as unfair persecution while continuing core patterns in less visible ways. Reports from staff and associates during the 2000s and 10s described ongoing young female visitors at his properties, though no new criminal complaints reached authorities until much later. Public awareness remained low until the late 2000s. Mainstream media coverage of the 2008 plea had been relatively muted, partly due to the era's limited focus on sex trafficking networks involving elites, partly because of Epstein's ability to manage press through legal threats and settlements. The story simmered in legal circles and among victim advocates, but did not dominate headlines. That changed in November 2018, when the Miami Herald published Perversion of Justice, a 7-part investigative series by reporter Julie K. Brown. The series detailed the plea deal's flaws, interviewed dozens of victims who had never spoken publicly, exposed the lack of victim notification, and highlighted Acosta's role. The articles reignited national attention, prompted victim testimonies, and pressured federal authorities to revisit the case. Within months, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York opened a new investigation, one not constrained by the 2007 NPA. Epstein's decade of relative impunity was ending. The machinery that had protected him for so long, wealth, connections, legal maneuvering, and institutional caution, was about to face renewed, more aggressive scrutiny. Part 9. Renewed scrutiny and the 2019 arrest. The turning point arrived in November 2018. The Miami Herald published Perversion of Justice, a 7-part investigative series by reporter Julie K. Brown. Over months of reporting, Brown located and interviewed more than 80 women who said they had been recruited and abused by Epstein as minors, many of whom had never spoken publicly before. The series meticulously reconstructed the 2005 to 2008 investigation, exposed the non-prosecution agreement's flaws, detailed the Crime Victims' Rights Act violations, and questioned why federal authorities had allowed such a lenient outcome for a man accused of operating a trafficking network. The articles triggered immediate fallout. Within weeks, federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York, jurisdictionally separate from the 2007 Miami Agreement, opened a new investigation. Unlike the earlier probe, this one was not bound by the 2007 non-prosecution deal, which covered only conduct through 2007. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the SDNY, under Jeffrey Berman, assembled a team focused on post-2007 activity, interstate commerce elements, and any continuing patterns. The #MeToo movement's cultural shift had already changed how sex trafficking and abuse allegations involving powerful men were handled. Greater emphasis on victim-centered approaches, willingness to pursue historical cases, and more aggressive use of financial and travel records to map networks. Investigators subpoenaed banks, airlines, and phone companies for records dating back years. They re-interviewed victims from the Florida case and identified new ones. Key evidence included updated flight logs showing continued use of Epstein's private jets for travel with young women into the 2000s and 10s. Financial transactions documenting payments to recruiters and victims. Employee statements from properties in New York, Palm Beach, and the Virgin Islands. Materials seized in earlier civil suits that had remained under seal or limited access. By spring 2019, the case had gained sufficient momentum for an indictment. On July 6, 2019, Epstein's Boeing 727, tail number N550GP, landed at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey shortly after 4 p.m., returning from Paris. FBI agents and Homeland Security investigations personnel were waiting on the tarmac. Epstein was arrested as he stepped off the plane. The federal complaint, unsealed the same day in Manhattan, charged him with 1 count of sex trafficking of minors and 1 count of conspiracy to commit sex trafficking, offenses carrying potential life sentences. The indictment described a conspiracy from at least 2002 to 2005, overlapping the prior Florida probe, but emphasized that the conduct facilitated a broader, ongoing enterprise.
It alleged Epstein and associates recruited dozens of underage girls, paid them for sexualized massages that escalated to abuse, and used a network of recruiters to maintain a steady supply of victims. Prosecutors highlighted the interstate and international travel as jurisdictional hooks for federal authority.
Hours after the arrest, agents executed search warrants on Epstein's Manhattan townhouse at 9 East 71st Street. Inside, they recovered hundreds of sexually suggestive photographs of young women and girls, many appearing to be minors. Dozens of compact discs and hard drives labeled with female names and dates. Binders containing explicit images. Cash, diamonds, and a fraudulent passport, an Austrian passport with Epstein's photo but a different name, issued in the 1980s. Thousands of pages of documents, including message books, calendars, and financial records. The haul was described by prosecutors as tens of thousands of pages of evidence. Much of it corroborated victim accounts and demonstrated the systematic nature of the operation. Epstein was arraigned on July 8, 2019, before U.S. Magistrate Judge Deborah Freeman in Manhattan. Bail was denied. Prosecutors argued he posed an extreme flight risk, multiple passports, vast resources, private aircraft, and danger to the community, ongoing access to vulnerable individuals. He was remanded to the Metropolitan Correctional Center, MCC, a federal facility in Lower Manhattan, known for housing high-profile defendants. This phase reflected significant evolution in investigative techniques since 2005 to 2008. Victim-first approach. Greater reliance on survivor testimony, with trauma-informed interviewing and support services. Financial forensics. Tracing payments through banks and offshore entities to map the network. Digital evidence. Exploitation of seized devices and cloud records, tools far more advanced than in the mid-2000s. Interagency coordination. FBI, Homeland Security, IRS, Criminal Investigation Division, and NYPD worked together under SDNY leadership. Post-#MeToo momentum. Prosecutors showed less deference to elite status. Media scrutiny and public pressure reduced institutional hesitation. Epstein pleaded not guilty at his arraignment and remained in custody at MCC. His legal team filed motions challenging the charges and conditions of confinement, but the case appeared headed toward trial. The arrest marked the end of nearly 15 years of relative impunity. Yet the final chapter would unfold far more abruptly than anyone anticipated. Jeffrey Epstein entered the Metropolitan Correctional Center, MCC, in Lower Manhattan on July 8, 2019, following his denial of bail. The facility, a high-security federal jail, housed him in the Special Housing Unit under suicide watch, initially due to the gravity of the charges and his high profile. On July 23, 2019, guards found him semi-conscious in his cell with neck injuries. He was placed back on suicide watch, but removed from it 6 days later after a psychiatric evaluation. On August 9th, his cellmate was transferred out, leaving him alone, contrary to Bureau of Prisons policy for at-risk inmates. Early on the morning of August 10, 2019, correctional officers discovered Epstein unresponsive, hanging from a bedsheet tied to the top bunk. He was pronounced dead at New York Downtown Hospital at 6:39 a.m. The New York City Chief Medical Examiner, Dr. Barbara Sampson, ruled the death a suicide by hanging on August 16th after an autopsy. The ruling cited ligature furrow marks consistent with hanging, petechial hemorrhages in the eyes, and no defensive wounds or signs of struggle. A private pathologist hired by Epstein's brother, Dr. Michael Baden, later suggested the injuries could be consistent with homicidal strangulation, but the official determination stood. The Department of Justice's Office of the Inspector General conducted a comprehensive review, released in June 2023, concluding that multiple procedural failures contributed to the death. Falsified logs by guards, malfunctioning cameras outside the cell, inadequate rounds, and removal from suicide watch without sufficient justification. No evidence of criminal foul play was found. Epstein's death halted the criminal prosecution against him. The charges were dismissed on August 29, 2019. However, the investigation continued against associates. Ghislaine Maxwell was arrested on July 2, 2020, in New Hampshire. She faced federal charges in the Southern District of New York for conspiracy to entice minors to travel for illegal sex acts, transportation of minors for criminal sexual activity, sex trafficking of minors, and related conspiracies. Her trial began in November 2021. Prosecutors presented testimony from 4 victims who described recruitment and abuse facilitated by Maxwell between 1994 and 2004. Flight logs, financial records, and message books corroborated their accounts. On December 29, 2021, a jury convicted Maxwell on 5 of 6 counts. She was sentenced on June 28, 2022, to 20 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release and a $750,000 fine. Appeals have been denied as of 2025. Civil litigation persisted. In 2019 to 2020, dozens more victims came forward. A compensation fund administered by Kenneth Feinberg paid out more than $121 million to over 135 claimants between 2020 and 2021. Major institutions addressed past ties. Harvard returned $6.5 million in donations. MIT returned $850,000. Banks, J.P. Morgan Chase and Deutsche Bank, settled lawsuits for hundreds of millions over allegations they facilitated Epstein's activities through lax oversight of suspicious transactions. The Epstein case produced enduring lessons for law enforcement, prosecution, and institutional accountability. Victim protections. The 2008 CVRA violations spurred stricter enforcement of notification and participation rights. Post-2018 guidelines emphasize trauma-informed interviewing and earlier victim involvement in plea negotiations. Trafficking investigations. Greater focus on network analysis, following money trails, travel patterns, digital evidence, and recruiter hierarchies rather than isolated incidents. The hashtag #MeToo era encouraged prosecutors to pursue historical cases with renewed vigor. Sweetheart deals scrutiny. The 2007 NPA became a cautionary example of prosecutorial overreach and underreach. It prompted reviews of non-prosecution agreements involving sex crimes and powerful defendants. Institutional failures. Universities, banks, and charities faced criticism for accepting Epstein's money without due diligence. Many adopted enhanced donor vetting protocols. Suicide prevention in custody. The MCC lapses led to Bureau of Prisons reforms, better camera maintenance, stricter adherence to suicide watch protocols, and improved staffing ratios, though implementation has been uneven. Epstein's life and crimes exposed how wealth, status, and connections can delay justice for years. His ability to operate across decades relied on systemic gaps, deferential treatment of elites, fragmented jurisdiction, victim silencing through settlements, and reluctance to challenge powerful figures.
The case remains a benchmark for how far investigative practices have evolved and how much further they must go to prevent similar abuses of power. The story of Jeffrey Epstein is not one of a solitary predator, but of a constructed ecosystem, one built on money, manipulation, and institutional blind spots that enabled harm on a significant scale. Its unraveling, though incomplete, forced reckoning with those failures and reshaped approaches to holding the powerful accountable.